Good afternoon and welcome to the Laurier Northern webinar series. For those of you who have not joined before, this is a monthly series of virtual webinars that highlights Laurier's multidisciplinary Northern research, which is conducted in close collaboration with Northern communities, partners, and institutions in the Northwest Territories and other Northern locations. For today's webinar, we have 5 speakers bringing you different perspectives and research on Indigenous conservation and Indigenous leadership, in conservation and protected areas. With all our webinars, we do start with a land acknowledgement. I acknowledge that Wilfrid Laurier University's Ontario campuses, situated on the Haldeman Tract, reside upon the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. This land holds significance as part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, symbolizing their commitment to sharing, safeguarding resources, and living in peace with each other. Today, this gathering place serves as a home to numerous First Nations, Métis, and Indigenous communities from across Turtle Island. Additionally, we extend our respectful acknowledgement of Laurier's research activities in the Northwest Territories. Laurier has established permanent infrastructure in Yellowknife on the traditional territories and ancestral homeland of the Dene, Inuit, and Métis people of the Northwest Territories, as well as the traditional territory of the Yellowknife Dene First Nation, Chief Jimmy Drygee's territory, and the homeland of the North Slave Métis. We further extend our respect to all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people of the North who call this territory home. We are grateful to the Indigenous people of the Northwest Territories for allowing us the privilege of learning, working, and residing on their lands. Additionally, we deeply appreciate the generous sharing of traditional knowledge, wisdom, and ways of knowing. To express our gratitude, we can engage in continuous learning, open dialogue, and thoughtful reflection about the rich histories, cultures, and contributions of Indigenous peoples. Through our ongoing learning efforts, we aim to foster understanding and build meaningful relationships with the Indigenous communities on whose land we live and work. Today's webinar is co-hosted by Laurier's Cold Regions Research Center. I'll turn it over to Dr. Alex Latta to let you know more about the Research Center and introduce our speakers for today. Go ahead, Alex.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. So I'm the past director of the Cold Regions Research Center, the CRRC. Actually started the collaboration on this panel during the final months of my time in that role. The CRRC is grateful for the opportunity to co-sponsor the panel, and it is a real privilege to play the role of moderator today. Our current director, Dr. Homa Hirolapur, sends her regrets. She is en route to Delaunay. For those unfamiliar with the CRRC, we are one of Laurier's longest running research centers, established in 1987. Emerging at that time out of a collaborative multidisciplinary project on snow and ice hydrology in the Karakoram Himalaya of northern Pakistan. We are now much more northern Canada focused in our work, especially within Laurier's constellation of research partnerships and projects in the Northwest Territories. As moderator today, I'd like to situate myself in relation to the topic. I'm a non-Indigenous Canadian of Scottish and English settler heritage. I've been working in the field of Indigenous rights and environmental governance for about 20 years, the most recent decade in partnership with Indigenous organizations, governments, and communities in the Northwest Territories. Like Lisa, I'm joining the call today from the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and neutral or Arawandran peoples. So we have 3 presentations for you today, 2 that pair discussions of practice and research in relation to protected areas, Indigenous guardians, and other dimensions of stewardship, and 1 that is focused on relationships with water. The first 2 are presenter teams that we've given 15 minutes each, and the third one is a solo presenter who will speak for 10 minutes. And I will jump in and prompt our speakers if they're running a bit over time, but otherwise we'll allow them to keep their own time. And we will look forward to your questions at the end. So we could move to the first intro slide now. Great, so our first speakers today, I'm really pleased to have with us Jessica Jumbo, Director of Lands and Resources with Dehcho First Nations, coming to us from Sabourin in the Northwest Territories, and Ryan Planche, PhD student here at Wilfrid Laurier University, who's currently located in Yellowknife, Northwest Territories.
Thanks, Alex, and welcome everyone. Glad to be here. So as Alex said, I'm Ryan Planche. I'm calling in from Yellowknife, and I have about 3 years of experience working in the Dehcho on protected areas, and I've had the distinct pleasure of working with Jessica Jumbo, who I'm presenting with today, over those past few years. And Jessica, I'll let you introduce yourself as well.
Hi, my name's Jessica Jumbo. I'm a Dehcho Dene, Sabourin Gotine, that's Sabourin people. I've been working in the field of protected areas since I was 15 years old, mostly at a community level, and now have moved to a regional level. I'm happy to be here. Must-eat.
Awesome, Jess. So we're going to be talking about new pathways and challenges in Dehcho Dene-Led protected areas. And we're going to be talking about some new pathways forward and some of the existing challenges in the protected areas. Sorry. So just sort of briefly, we're talking about new opportunities. So Jess will speak to Dene relationships. We'll both sort of talk about colonial tools and new ways forward. For those who don't know, the Dehcho region in the NWT is located in this purple region. That's the southwestern part of the NWT in Canada, so just north of Alberta and BC. And this map is the network of conservation zoning and the protected areas in the Dehcho. So there's about 2.5 million hectares of CPAs, or candidate protected areas, in the South Dehcho that are not established yet, but on their way. And part of the work is on a federal grant called the Nature Fund. And that is $10 million over 4 years to bring these areas into establishment. And as Jess can attest to, this has been over 20 years in the making. Maybe you want to speak to the history of development there in Sabourin or in the Dehcho.
Yeah, so over 20 years of work, and it started off with each community trying to develop in traditional knowledge studies, which was pointing out specific areas that they felt that needed to be protected, whether it be for wildlife sensitive areas, cultural sensitive areas, and especially waterways was the first priority.
Yeah, and we were so in the NWT, they had an older system called the Protected Areas System, PAS, staged work, and now we're sort of off of that path and picking up from where we left off after devolution, which happened in 2014. That was the federal government devolving powers of authority to the JNWT, or the territorial government. So we have these new opportunities, right, in Indigenous-led conservation, and that's sort of the pledge from the federal government. And we have our JNWT and territorial partners on side as well. And there are a lot of other conservation and nature-based organizations that have come in to support and are currently, still doing so alongside. So it takes a real kind of national, regional, local village of people to move these move protected areas forward, and we're in sort of a new relationship with how authority works. And there are also a lot of questions that still have to be sort of answered about the Dene authority and responsibility for their own lands. So we have this new Indigenous Protected and Conserved Area framework for these new relationships. Folks like Sabourin and Kagi2 and Jean Marie and Katladiche in the Nature Fund in the Dehcho are also, they have the ability to, and now resources to network with other nations to do this kind of collaborative work. There's resources to support capacity and also building conservation management into scale for the various areas. And they're kind of moving forward together. And Jess, I don't know if you wanted to talk about sort of that together vision.
Moving forward together would mean for us, with all different departments, federal government, Indigenous, is trying to comprehend where each other's coming from and the ability to understand what each needs are when we're trying to establish this area, and trying to just collaborate better and move forward together, and that it's just a common goal, but having that Indigenous Dene law and guideline as the base, because really that's where it's going to suit these communities trying to build these management plans. And the biggest thing is trying to support each other in capacity building, because we know these communities are small, and taking on these workloads is pretty huge. So collaborating well with our partners is a huge thing.
Yeah, and sharing that capacity regionally too is also, it's complicated because people are few and far between at times, and there's not a lot of times where you can kind of get together, everyone can get together. So yeah, go ahead, Jess.
So this is the Dene relationships and people land, and really a big thing for the protected area for Indigenous people and in this region is we're really protecting and honoring the ancestors' vision of making sure the water and the wildlife is healthy. But not only that, it's keeping ourselves healthy too at the same time, and honoring that cultural base and those skills, those tactics and belief that was passed on to us. So land protection and the protected areas, or IPCAs, are very vital to the Indigenous people. The connection we have with the land is unexplainable, and we're trying to move away from this concept of being on the land and really adjusting our minds around the fact that we are with the land and we move with the land. Indigenous people for years have studied the cycles, have been involved and done everything by the way things change, by the way fish run in water, what type of season, and when the moose run. And so we're kind of integrated in those cycles and moving away from that concept of being on and being with it. Not only that, stating that we're with the land and with these cycles, it gives Indigenous people that healthy mentality. And anything that happens from land to land, whether it's IPCAs here or anywhere else, when Indigenous people hear that their land is being protected anywhere, it already gives us this strength and belief that we are honoring what our ancestors passed on to us, that our food sources are healthy, that the water is healthy for the wildlife, for us, our wind patterns trying to stay normal. That is a huge mental wellness for Indigenous people. And the fact that we're trying to put this forth is like I said, vital to not just Indigenous people of this region, but Indigenous people everywhere. And when we're talking about, oh, go ahead, Ryan. Sorry.
No, you go ahead. It's all good.
No, I kind of lost my train of thought.
We were talking before about like these new forms of stewardship. So you just said it essentially, but like the relationship to land and water there for Dene people has not ever been broken. Whereas I'm coming in as a settler, as somebody who's not from here. So I can speak to sort of how my relationships may have been broken and how I would get back to it. There's a big distinction between like using some of the colonial tools and relationships, and we're talking about these intact spiritual ecologies that are already present and have never gone away for Dene folks. So to talk a little bit about colonial tools, so tenure and legislation, kind of high points of that discussion. What we did, Jess and I did talk about. So these are kind of double-edged sword pieces, right? They're not all bad and they're not all good either, as we know. So, ownership, this concept of land ownership is sort of prevalent in this fee simple arrangement of geography and how that is developed in land use planning, and also in how governments are oriented to understand who is in control of and who has authority over land. And that is not necessarily a concept that's organic or inherent to Dene culture or laws. Legal protection is, of course, really complicated because it means that, at least up here, Indigenous governments have to work with colonial governments like the GNWT or like the federal government in order to do permanent legal protection of their conservation. Land use planning, like I said before, is a kind of useful protection tool, and it is being co-developed with Dene people in the Dehcho, and specifically the Dehcho land use plan. But it's a colonial tool, right, of organizing and categorizing land management. There's also this question of development and how that plays into the conservation would like to be productive in terms of development, so renewable or non-renewable resources. There is a history of mining diamonds and oil and gas in the Dehcho region. There's an active sulfur mine right now that is in Nahanni Butte around that national park. And then there's also this piece of the national goal of having 30% of lands and waters protected by 2030. So this is allowing for a lot of this movement, a lot of the resources, financial resources, to get at these protected areas set in place. But in terms of scale on the ground with communities, they're not as obviously concerned with what Canada's international geopolitical commitments are to conservation. So, I forgot to mention these last two images were generated by ChatGPT-4. So I told it to do things like, this one is combine two different knowledge streams together in nature conservation. So this is what it gave us. Yeah, so to close off for us, we wanted to talk a little bit about shared stewardship. And so we were speaking about this before, but there's this model that Haida Gwaii, that management and that establishment agreement was based on, which is we have to agree to disagree about ownership. So shared stewardship means that the decisions about land in any context for Haida Gwaii have to be made with all parties in consensus at the table, and it doesn't sort of privilege any one decision maker or authority over another. And so that's sort of something we think about when we're doing protected areas in the Dehcho. And I don't know, it's a proven model. It's a very specific case in BC, of course, but shared stewardship does a lot to acknowledge the complexity of the relationships. So in terms of other new ways forward, there's also legal pathways and partnerships, so new relationships to establish how these protected areas are going to be permanently protected. And there's also the conversation about conservation-based economies. So how is development going to happen, and how does it want to happen, and what do the people on the ground want to have development look like in terms of the longevity of economies of scale that are based on conservation. So like, for example, in Samba Cay, there is a very new development of the fishing lodge. And I don't know, Jess, if you wanted to talk about that, but connected to the protected area will make a big difference.
Yeah, sure. I could talk about the lodge. So the idea of the lodge in Samba Cay would be geared to ecotourism, like a cultural driven lodge. And a lot of it is not using, but the Dene in that area sharing the land and their cultural activities with people coming in to visit. But not only that, having it run specific seasons, but it's also because of capacity that we've talked about, it has to overlap with some of the programming that we're doing. And that's a big thing, is the guardians are the ones who are going to be the ones monitoring these IPCAs and doing that on the ground work for their communities in their areas, and overlapping that with a lodge and having it tourism, called ecocultural tourism lodge, and then you're overlapping it with a guardian training center or those guardian headquarters. So not only that, people coming to visit can just get a taste too of what monitoring on the land looks like and could be possibly available through all the seasons. So that was a really big initiative for the community, which could hopefully spread throughout the region and be a shared concept with everybody, and just an easier collaborative way to be able to run those IPCAs and network with each other and be able just to, like we said, move forward together.
That's a perfect place to end. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Jess.
Great.
Masi.
Thanks. Masi, Jessica, and Ryan. So we're ready to move on to our next presentation. We now have Dr. Andrew Spring, Canada Research Chair in Northern Sustainable Food Systems from the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at Laurier, and Dr. Dietrich, Advisor Dehcho Dene-Led Government and Senior Researcher in the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at Laurier as well. So I'll pass it over to the two of you. Please take it away.
Okay, great. Again, thanks for the opportunity for being here. And thanks to our previous presenters, Ryan, for setting this up. I'm not going to say a lot today. Today is a lot of a culmination of 10 years at work that I've been doing up in Delaunay and supporting Dene-Led government and the Lands Department. I get to pass it off to Dietrich, who does a lot of this work on the ground. I'm here to as a backup in case her internet fails, but hopefully we're going to be hearing from Dawn for most of the time and really kind of walking through what we've been up to in supporting some of the IPCA work and the land stewardship work in Delaunay over the past several years. So Dawn, if you want to take over.
Thanks, Andrew. Hello, everyone. I'm Dawn Dietrich, and Alex has already introduced me, so I'll just add a thank you for inviting me to be here. I'm also going to be turning my video off right now because I'm joining you from a tiny cubby at the Explorer Hotel in Yellowknife and about to catch a flight to Delaunay in like less than an hour. So lickety split and no video. So okay. So, yeah, we're both here today to talk about how we as academic allies support Dehcho leadership in conservation, but also how that work comes with challenges as well as opportunities for positive transformation. And we're going to start off by putting this struggle on the table right away with the current challenge that we're facing. It reflects the larger issues that we grapple with in efforts to do this work in a good way. So I was supposed to be joining you today doing this presentation with Delaunay Satu Kawe Indigenous Protected and Conserved Area, or IPCA manager. Unfortunately, she had to leave the position after only a short time. And so now doubling of efforts is essentially required to get both the position filled and keep the work moving in a good way. And it also raises what is now the problematic reality of two white people sitting here talking with you about Indigenous-led conservation. So Given these challenges, we've decided to shift the focus of our talk from what was going to be a discussion about Delaunay's IPCA efforts to instead not only highlighting the amazing accomplishments in Satu-Go-Tene conservation leadership, but also talking about how academic allies can support this work in a myriad of ways that goes beyond research. So first, though, I think it's really worth talking about really quick, the word allyship. I just want to be clear, I'm not talking about ally as a noun, but a verb. The allyship that I'm talking about is reconciliation in action. It's long-term cross-cultural relationship building that requires us to push ourselves in both practical and theoretical ways. But anyway, enough intro, let's just get into the work. Slide, please. So first, a bit about the area. Satsue, or the Great Bear Lake watershed, as it's known in English, makes up the entirety of the Delaunay district and is located here, as you can see in the bottom corner of your screen, in the Satu region of the Northwest Territories. The watershed makes up an area of approximately 146,000 square kilometers, or 13% of the land area of the Northwest Territories. And Satsue, the lake itself, represents the dominant feature within the watershed. It has a surface area of 31,000 square kilometers, and so it is the largest lake wholly contained within the borders of Canada. Delaunay is the only community on the lake, which in Dene-Led means where the water flows, and it's located at the mouth of the Great Bear River on the western shore of the lake. The community is fly-in only, with a winter access road allowing for goods to be shipped and visits to relatives and friends during the coldest months. It is home to approximately 600 people, most of whom are Satu Dene and Métis people, or more specifically the Satu-Go-Tene or Delaunay-Go-Tene, which translates to the people of the lake. Slide, please. So, since time immemorial, Satsue has been a special place for the Satu-Go-Tene. Their ancestors had cared for this place for countless generations, and today the Satu Dene and Métis people remain strongly connected to the land and lake. And like Jessica talked about in the Dehcho, and like Indigenous peoples more generally, Satu-Go-Tene culture, spirituality, and laws, or Dene Sili, being Dene, is intricately connected to the many prophecies and stories of the lake, including Tutse, or the water heart, a story I'm not going to go into, but suffice to say, it is the heart of the lake, which is connected to all beings. And so the water heart, helps sustain the entire watershed of Satsue. And because the water heart is essential to the maintenance of all, the health of the people and the land are deeply woven together. And so as the teachings and prophecies go, any use of the lake and its watershed must be respectful, as it will have a direct impact on the health of all. So in this way, healthy land and water are of critical importance for not only the livelihoods and food of the food security of the Satu-Go-Tene, but also for transmission of culture. And so the elders have long asserted a responsibility to treat the watershed with respect, to keep it alive, and protect it for all future generations. Slide, please. So Satu-Go-Tene efforts to assert this responsibility to protect the lake are long and varied. For the purposes of time, I'm not going to go into all of these protection measures that you can see on your screen. Sorry for all of the information, but it's important that it's listed. And these are only just the most recent. But suffice to say, this is obviously this flows in a long line of building blocks toward land and water sovereignty in Delaunay. So today we're going to focus our talk on just a couple of these Satu-Go-Tene stewardship programs, the Satsue Biosphere Reserve, Satu-Kawe IPCA and Guardians, and Youth Council, and how we as academic allies support this work. So let's get into the programs. The first, the Biosphere Reserve, which was established in 2016, is the world's first Indigenous-led UNESCO Biosphere designation. and recognizes the Satu Dene and Métis people's rights to the land, its protection, and their stewardship practices. The purpose of the Biosphere Reserve and its council, made up entirely of Satu-Go-Dene members, is to act as the community hub or the heart, supporting ecological and cultural protection work. The Satsue Biosphere Reserve basically brings the community together to achieve its 4 mandates: to support research and monitoring work, sustainable development, conservation planning, and build educational programs. And these programs in turn support the work of the IPCA Guardians and Youth, which we'll get to in a minute. And as advisors for the Biosphere Reserve, we support all of these conservation mechanisms, not only as researchers ourselves, but also providing practical hands-on support for the programs, workshops, network of researchers on the land camps, and so much more. Slide, please. And so if the Biosphere Reserve is the global recognition of Satu-Go-Dene leadership in conservation, the IPCA is the legal partnership agreement with Canada and the Government of Northwest Territories that can support elevating Satu-Go-Dene land stewardship rights, ways of knowing, and responsibilities to protect Satsue. And since I believe everyone here is very familiar with IPCAs, what they do and what they are, I'm not going to go into that, but I will briefly talk about where Dene is at in this work. So currently, the Dene-Go-Dene government is working with the Government of Northwest Territories to define their partnership agreement. And so I won't actually be able to go into this, but I can say there's lots of great work happening on the Satu-Kawe IPCA front. We've not only been working on the intergovernmental negotiations, but also developing the core activities, holding community engagement workshops to develop the Satu-Kawe mandate and principles, reporting back to community and leadership on the work, and working to get the IPCA manager trained, and so much more. So it's exciting times in Dene's stewardship story, to be sure. Slide, please. So if the Biosphere Reserve is the programming support epicenter and the IPCA its legal framework, the Guardians program is the on the land Satu-Go-Dene management mechanism. Like Jessica talked about earlier, the Guardians are essentially the eyes on the ground and will lead everything from research, monitoring, and management work for the IPCA to protect biodiversity and ecological health. So to date, the Guardians have been trained on water quality testing and fish health, and we are in the process of getting Guardians trained to work with researchers to conduct regular all-season surveys of the environmental conditions and biodiversity of Great Bear Lake and the watershed. And we've also, in addition to other tasks that we just don't have time to go into today, I'll just quickly add that the Guardians are also paramount in the maintenance of ancestral trails, the historic portage sites, and building cabins in areas not only important to the physical heritage of the Satu-Go-Dene, but also necessary, for instance, to accessing traditional foods and critical to land-based activities, as well as community gatherings and ceremonies. So ensuring not only food security, but the preservation and revitalization of culture. And our support in this work, beyond research again, often looks like developing work plans, facilitating workshops, providing training, and much more. Slide, please. And so key mandate of all Satu-Go-Dene work is youth involvement to support healing, intergenerational knowledge sharing, and cultural revitalization. And an important mechanism for that engagement has been the Dene Akoneke, so the Delene's Youth Council. And it was established in 2019 with support from CHAP funding, and the council empowers youth to share their voices, connects them to the various community organizations, leadership, and programs taking place so that they are involved in the work. And one way the community, with support from Wilfrid Laurier, supports these efforts is to develop and implement land-based programs to build skills and knowledge around everything from traditional food harvesting to the impacts of climate change. And doing so is not only paramount to the effective stewardship of Satsue and sustainability of Satu-Go-Dene culture, but engaging youth ensures that the next generation have the skills and training necessary to feed themselves, pass on traditions, and protect Satsue for all time. Yeah, you're already there. So finally, just a few lessons that we've learned from all this solidarity work to advance Satsue Dene leadership in conservation. Well, for one, reconciliatory work is really big, complex work, you know, relationship building, trust building, supporting healing work, language programs, housing issues, cultural revitalization, Indigenous sovereignty work, you know, these are all critical and interconnected with work to protect the land. And this cross-cultural work takes time. Building capacity takes time, and it's critical. So we need our academic institutions to support us in taking this space. We need to write the space needed to do this work in a good way into our grants. We also need to work in teams of people, you know, and not just academics, but ENGOs, lawyers, consultants, artists, activists. It's a multifaceted teams that can help support a diversity of needs. So, you know, of course, we can't be everything to everyone, but we can build good networks to help. And as academic allies, you know, our research often has to be secondary. We need to wear many hats, and only one of those is researcher. Of course, supporting community identified research and monitoring priorities is critical. It's work we love to do, but in addition to doing good participatory action research, I've personally been responsible for everything from minute taking to driving elders to workshops. I've been a really bad fisher, a childminder, a community event support person, a tea getter, a staff trainer, and anyway, so much more. And that's not me saying, yay me, that's just me. That's just been me learning to be more than who I was trained to be, you know? If you're only focused on research, you'll miss the interconnected needs and opportunities to do good work. And so finally, funding, I just want to say, you know, to do good community-led holistic research that takes everything from climate change adaptation to cultural revitalization into account, we need funders to show up. We need them to decolonize their protocols and procedures. You know, you can't be asking communities to apply to 5 different pots of money to do what they see as interconnected work. You're drawing down on capacity, and if they're having to manage 5 separate grants, that makes things more challenging. So in closing, if our collective goal as allies is to advance Indigenous-led conservation, if it is conservation through reconciliation, then we can and should support all the parameters, space, time, and teachings needed to do this work in a good way. Slide, please. And that's it. Merci cho. Thank you, everyone. And I'll pass it back over to Lisa and Alex.
Thank you so much, Dawn. And I think, Dawn, you need to leave to catch a plane. So probably, Dawn, you will not be here when we get to questions. So thank you so much for your contributions today, and wishing you a safe flight.
Thank you, everyone. So happy to be here. Take care.
Take care. So our final speaker, I'm really pleased to have Emily Sabourin with us. When I reached out to one of my primary folks that I work with at Dehcho First Nations to ask for some advice about putting this panel together, Ramona Pearson, she said, you need a youth on the panel. And there's a lot of really amazing work being done by youth around Indigenous-led conservation in the Northwest Territories. So really happy to have Emily with us. Emily Sabourin is a law student in the joint degree program in Canadian Common Law and Indigenous Legal Orders at the University of Victoria. So Emily, I'll let you share your screen and take it away from here.
Hi, everyone. I'm very pleased to have this invitation to speak today. Yeah, as Alex said, I'm a law student at UVic. I'm in my 2nd year, and I typically introduce myself as a split mix of both my parents. I mean, obviously I'm a mix of both my parents, but what I mean is I get this academic side from my mom, Dr. Susan Catlin, and I get an artistic side from my father, John Sabourin. He's a Dene stone carver, originally from Quay or Fort Simpson. So I'm really passionate about arts. I've been beading for over 7 years now. So I have included art in my presentation. And I think that art is really, well, can often do a better job at conveying a message than written word can. For example, we see, or I see a lot in my courses, that the courts are trying to interpret this written word and it can be manipulated, whereas art can be expressed in many forms and interpreted in many different ways to find meaning. So starting with the first slide, I've included art by Lawrence Paul Yakwelipton. He's a Vancouver artist of Okanagan and Cowichan descent. And I really appreciate his work because it addresses political, environmental, and cultural issues, and really ties into my discussion here today. So the header, the more than human world, is a term or language that I see often in some of my courses. And it's such a weird term to me because, I mean, it's weird to me, the fact that we would need to draw attention to the fact that that humans aren't the only living beings in this world. And we do often think that we're at the center of things, and that gets reflected in legal language like ownership, for example, but also in language like resources and conservation, which has a colonial history. So the first piece, Red Man Watching White Man Trying to Fix Hole in the Sky, makes me think about how the laws really are, well, environmental laws really are tied to science, which is so limited in terms of what's available. And so those appear to be scientists in the lab coat trying to fix the hole in the sky. And it also makes me think of a presentation in one of my courses recently by Spencer Greening. He's Shimshan, and he talks about using science as more of a supplementary tool than the only truth. So that's something that really resonates with me and I would like to take forward in my studies. The other painting is an Indian game, Juggling the Books. So there's this figure wearing a suit. So I'm going to assume it's a federal government worker. He's holding a book called Indian Country, and the other one is Nation to Nation. So it really, to me, depicts the irony of turning to black letter law and other Western empirical sources in the discourse of decolonization and the journey of reconciliation, where there are lots of different sources of knowledge all around him, which he doesn't seem to notice because he's very busy juggling these books. And it's a really cool piece. Well, all of his pieces are really cool to me because they're painted in super saturated rainbow hue figures and ovoids. So it really encourages this introspection into the relationship we have with the land, animals, and others. So this next slide is reconciliation with the earth. And a lot of Indigenous scholars will talk about reconciliation between the Crown and Indigenous peoples really does require this reconnection with the earth. And that is not currently reflected in the legal system. For instance, I mentioned the language of ownership and resources. And when we think about water as a resource, it's really backwards because water is life. We are 60 to 70% water. It's really a necessity, but that is not recognized or reflected or appreciated. And actually yesterday in my water law course, we were looking at the Water Sustainability Act here in BC, and I learned that clean drinking water really isn't the priority of the government, it often gets pushed aside for economic development like forestry. And this development really does compromise the health of the water bodies. So starting reconciliation with the earth, I thought a good starting point is just recognizing place names, because those place names hold and carry so many obligations that are tied to the land, and that's recognized in the laws of a region, of a place, and also tied to the creation stories. So I've included the Dene laws, not to explain, but just to share. So for example, place names, when we think about the Mackenzie River, it's named after a European explorer, and it really carries no significance of our relationships with the water, whereas the Dehcho, which just translates to big river, it actually carries more meaning than that in the Dene language. It translates more to river of big significance because of water's capacity to sustain life and ecosystems. So lastly, accountability to water really does mean carrying forward those obligations and responsibilities that are tied to our relationship with the land and rekindling those relationships. So really thinking about our relationships and how we interact through more than just one lens. So carrying those values that were discussed throughout the presentations today is really a positive step forward. And these places have their own agency and are living beings. So again, the more than human world, it's just the natural world that sustains life. And so I've included pictures of Northern Lights. These were just taken by my dad in our backyard in Yellowknife. And so I'm sure a lot of people have heard, don't whistle at the Northern Lights. And that was something I was told really young, but really didn't know what it meant. So I never did. But to me, as a Dene woman or as a Dene person, the Northern Lights, the Naka, are these spirits, our ancestors. And so you don't whistle at them because there's a belief that they will take you with them. And so recognizing these kinds of, this kind of relationship with the Northern Lights, with the natural world, reflects these spirits with their own agency, that they have the power to take you away if you're not treating them respectfully. So taking that respect forward and our obligations to the place are really an important step in holding ourselves accountable. I'm not sure if that was 10 minutes, but yeah, Masi Cho for listening.
Thank you so much, Emily. Beautiful, beautiful art and really, really, really fascinating and thought-provoking connections there. Thank you. So we now have some time for questions, and you can put your questions into the chat. And I noticed that there's some other stuff going on in the chat as well. And so, yeah, if I noticed that Trevor was sharing a report about water gathering. So Trevor Teed from Dene Nation. So if anyone else wanted that, if you wanted to write him in the chat, I'm sure he'd be happy to share with you as well. So any questions for our presenters? So maybe I will get us going. I wanna sort of connect up those final our final presenter there, the idea of water and other non-human parts of the what in from a colonial perspective we call the environment, having agency. And I wanted to ask Jessica in particular, but others to comment as well, and Emily to say more if you'd like. But I wonder what, when we think about conservation, which Emily quite readily pointed out is, you know, a colonial term, how do we need to rethink what this is all about if we think about that agency that others have, that the non-human others have? So I'll put that out there, and especially, like I say, to Jessica, if you have some thoughts, but also to the other panelists.
Do you mean like how do we take that into account when we're trying to establish this IPCAs?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If it's not like a passive environment, the way we think about it from a kind of Western perspective, but it's actually all these agencies, all these beings that have their own, yeah, how does that change the way we think about it?
So, well, I guess conservation, you're right, was just a term that was kind of introduced to us like when we first started thinking about protection of areas. But for the way we live is when you're out somewhere, it's like what we say agencies or energies. Everything has its own energy, trees, water, like northern lights, like Emily was saying, everything has its own spirit. And it's something so natural, it's kind of above us. We are, the way we think about it in human form, is the last entity of the cycle. And it's something that we had privilege being put into by creator and stuff. So it's really even hard to grasp the word conservation. And I think I had a conversation with Ryan. It's a really hard concept to grasp for Indigenous people about what boundaries are, and this idea of we need to hit this quota of 30% protected, and we don't understand that. And because it's the spirits and everything are affecting us, and what we think about protection is we love to protect everything, but it's just not, there's a huge spiritual aspect to establishing an IPCA. And it's not just about, oh, keep the water healthy, keep the land healthy. It's about the respect that those things were put there to give us life. It was more per se a gift to us to continue our life and living. So it's a totally, I've had trouble understanding. And just like Emily, I was raised in the best of both worlds, is how my uncle put it. Is I was raised with my father, who's pure Dene. So I've lived on the land. I do harvest. I teach my kids that way. Every time we harvest something, we offer something back, whether it be tobacco or anything like that. We never take without giving something. And then my mom came from an academic world, so I was able to be raised, and that's where I really hope to add and contribute to these IPCAs, is trying to combine that colonial way of doing things with policies, procedures, and guidelines, and using the base of the Dene way, the Dene laws, that respect for the spirits of the animals, the waters, the wind, everything. So that's kind of, I hope that's what you're looking for.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Jess. I do see we have another question here in the chat from Warwick. What role, if any, have non-governmental organizations played in this work to establish Northern IPCAs? And if they have been involved, how has that relationship been navigated working with settler conservation organizations? So I'll put that to whoever wants to pick that one up.
Maybe I can start with that one and other people can jump in. Might as well answer a question, so I'm not just a glorified slide changer, right? It's a really interesting question, and I guess I think a lot of the initial work in Delaunay, and I think across a lot of the protected areas, or like even in the Guardian programs, started through a lot of NGO and kind of philanthropic organizations. So I can remember like Ducks Unlimited playing a fairly prominent role in Delaunay work in the early days, and I'm not sure what it looked like in other places. Their role is they're not quite on the field of play as they kind of once were, and I think maybe that kind of comes down to some of the federal mechanisms they're having with actually how to fund IPCAs and conservation areas moving forward, which is that like fund for perpetuity, I think it's called. Which is the kind of like the bringing together of all these funding organizations and supporting organizations into one kind of larger pot. It's not to say that that's a perfect way of doing it. I think we should kind of be a little bit there we go. That sounds much better. Thank you, Allison. Yeah, it's, you know, I kind of see that as kind of northern communities competing against each other, and I don't quite think this is kind of the right way to do it yet. But I think we're all kind of figuring that out. Yeah, and then it just comes down to yeah, just building some of those relationships. So I'm not sure what it looks like in other places. So in Delaunay, I believe that Ducks plays much smaller role, if any, than they kind of once did. But that is kind of the evolution of where the community wants to take their IPCA versus kind of the mandate and yeah, kind of the role of the NGO when they first started, right? So yeah, still out there. Again, this is a really new field, a new place, right? And it's always changing. So you know, maybe that's going to change again soon, but yeah, certainly lots of people out there. So I'm sure they play a role in other places.
Great, thanks, Andrew. So if anyone else wanted to jump in on that, please feel free to do so. I do have another question here that I'll go to. I realize we are at 4 and some people may be needing to leave the call, but maybe go on for another 5 minutes. So we do have a question here about natural climate solutions. And I know that we've heard a lot of talk, and there's been a lot of movement around natural climate solutions and thinking about Indigenous-led conservation as how it might link up to that. So I wonder if any of our panelists have experience with that and thoughts about where the direction of that is going. I know that within the Conservation for Reconciliation partnership, one of the working groups that spun out from that is looking at you know, carbon sequestration and carbon balances as linked into conservation planning and linked into potentially, I guess, that those conservation economies. And certainly there are examples of Indigenous protected areas that are trying to be funded through that, and the Great Bear Rainforest is a great example. Although they have struggled, partly because Canada's and generally the world, but Canada in particular, our carbon markets haven't developed as quickly as maybe was anticipated. So I just share that in the absence of any hands going up from our panelists. Okay, any other questions here in the last couple of minutes? So from Stuart, are there IPCAs in the province of Alberta? Good question. Not sure if any of our panelists wants to address that, given that most of them are working only in the NWT, but.
There is one, the Bisha Lake at Dene-Led. They've done a sovereign assertion there and worked with the province to designate their IPCA. And I think there's a few more in the works, northern Alberta.
Great. Thank you, Ryan. Note here from Claudia about Nature United and CPAWS and how they've been working supporting communities in NWT. Yeah, so some other examples there of non-governmental organizations that are working in this Indigenous-led conservation space. So thanks for that, Claudia. Okay, well, I don't see any other questions in the chat, so I think we'll call it quits with that. And thank you very much to everyone for attending. Yes, and thank you to our panelists. I really appreciate your time and sharing your wisdom and your knowledge with us today.
Yeah, and thanks everyone for joining. And a big thanks to Alex in the Cold Regions Research Center for co-hosting today. And of course, thanks to all of our speakers. We hope to see you at the next webinar in March, which will focus on northern water resources and climate change. Thanks, everyone.
Masicho, have a good day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Must see.